Thanks, James. And by the way, thank you for your interesting sharing on the general skill and the GTI. As James mentioned, GTI is the focus of the government at the moment. I'm going to take the rest of you through the business and the investment migration programs, which are also the target and the focus of the Australia government. Now, but before I start, Audrey, is there any particular question that you would like to ask as an interval?
Yes, Desmond. I wanted to ask the question, but I was thinking it's the noise is the noise has settled now, so I think it's a good time to catch James. Okay,
Sure.
James, there are some questions. Okay, this is for GTI. There's a client. There's someone asking, does the GTI include public sector management as well? Oh, I think James switched off. I think James had to switch off. Perhaps there's sound going on. So we will come to this Q&A later. Okay, we'll continue. I think, Desmond, you continue with your presentation first.
Sure, we'll do that.
We'll continue with the presentation.
Yeah, sure. Hi, again, from what you have seen on the screen, the business innovation visa. So this is what I'm going to talk about. This business innovation visa is basically a programs that's catered for the business owner. So when I talk about business owner, that explain you must have certain level of the business experience for you to be able to tap into these programs. So these programs, let's look at what the objective behind these programs. And why is it that this is the priority focus of the Australia immigration or the Australia government? Because this program is seen as, helping up with the post-pandemic recovery, obviously. So these programs would require migrants to set up, to operate a new or existing business in Australia. And you're not required to do it during the application, but rather after the visa is granted. Now, you do have the choice, unlike the general skill migration, where sometimes you just have to go with whichever states that have the opening. But whereas when it comes to this business migration, you can determine and decide on where you want to stay with your family in Australia. And we approach that respective state's government to get a nomination for you to be based in the states and set up your business in the states. So this is the general idea about the programs. And now these programs come with the two stages. The first stage is, is for you to have a visa ready to reside in Australia. And this is the visa called Subclass 188A. And this Subclass 188A is just a temporary residence visa. So we call that stage 1. Then while you're in Australia, there are certain criteria and requirements for you to achieve and fulfill. Then you will be qualified to apply for the PR, which is the Subclass 888. Now, you might be wondering what is the difference between TR and the PR here. So in general, when we talk about TR and the PR, when it comes to the study, so during the TR or during the Subclass 188 as a visa holder for Subclass 188, you do enjoy education benefits for primary school and secondary school. If your children are still at the primary and secondary school, then you will enjoy the benefits, the education benefits, just as a PR or a citizen from the day one. If your child is already at the stage of university level, then do take notes and bear in mind that the benefits comes in after you become the PR or he or she become the PR. Another difference is, as a PR, you do have the entitlement of the Medicare, which doesn't start during the temporary residence, but that is not a big deal. The government do recommend that the temporary residence visa holder to consider for a private insurance where the premium could be just on average of about 1,000 per year. Okay, so I'm going to take you through and to see what does it take for you to qualify for the stage 1, and later on, what does it take for you to meet the PR condition. Now, as a business owner, as I mentioned earlier, for you to apply for this visa, there are basic criteria for you to fulfill for you to be considered as qualified for this visa. First of all, you must already be a business owner. You're required to run the business for at least 2 years already. So this is the business that you must be involved in managing the business, and not just a shareholder, not just an investor, but you must be involved in managing the business in the day-to-day basis, right? So besides having the business experience and running the business for 2 years, you must also hold at least 30% of the share interest. If this applies to private limited company or partnership, sole proprietor, you have 100%. So it is not necessary for your company to be only private limited. The government do also accept if it is a sole proprietor or if it is a partnership. But if you're running the business as a public listed company, then your share percentage will be reduced to 10%. Now, that also comes with the turnover requirements. The business that you're running at the moment, you must already achieve 750,000 Aussie dollar equivalent per year. Okay, so do take notes. If you're running more than one business, then you can combine up to 2 businesses in order to meet the turnover requirement. So the first 3 criteria are pertaining to the business. Then the government do also take into consideration or do require you to demonstrate financial capacity, which is your net asset. So this net asset includes your personal assets, your spouse personal assets, as well as your company business asset by the percentage of the business that you own. And you need to have at least 1.25 million Aussie dollar equivalent. Yeah. So if you look at the requirements by now, so the requirements of these 4 criteria relatively is achievable. It is not making it too high for you not to be able to achieve. And most of the business owner potentially meeting all these requirements. But we are here to make sure and to verify and check your documents to make sure that they are all in order. Now, beside the first 4 criteria, then the subclass 188A do require in general the applicants to be below 55 years old. There's an age limit to that. Do take notes if you're above 55 and you still wish to explore this visa pathway, then we can seek age waiver from Western Australia, South Australia, for example. These are the states that consider giving you an age waiver for those who is above 55 years old. And this program does also come with the 65-point system where, your age will be taken into consideration, the percentage of, the turnover. Should your company have more than 750,000 and you are getting extra point, if your total net worth is more than 1.25 million, you do get extra point. The points are given to also your qualification, the amount of years of business experience that you have, whether or not your business has patent, and these are the things that gain you the extra point. So these would be the basic requirements for you to be able to apply for this subclass 188A, get you and your family over across to Australia, starts the life there, and after which you would need to start running the business. And I'm going to take you through to the next slide, which is what the visa condition is. And let's have a look at this. This is the second stage, 888. While you're in Australia, what does it take for you to qualify for the PR? Now, when we talk about the first stage of 188, right, the visa is valid for 5 years. So within the first 5 years, and you are under the temporary residence visa, as just mentioned earlier, and there are 6 criteria for you to fulfill. And when you fulfill this, then you can choose to apply to convert into the PR as quickly as after the third year, though you are given a 5 years temporary residence status. What are the requirements? Let's take a look. Number one, you must run the business for 2 years. That says you could choose to run the business on year 2, year 3, or year 3, year 4, or year 5, or year 4, or year 5. And in fact, if you are starting running the business on the year 1, then you would need to run the business across the first 3 years for you to be able to apply for the PR conversion after the third year. The same requirements on the share ownership, percentage of the share ownership for the company in Australia. You must be holding at least 30% of the share. You can take over an existing business. You can join a partners in Australia, or you could set up a new fresh business. And in Australia, now we talk about this business innovation. If you remember, the name for this program is called business innovation. But a lot of people might be thinking, what sort of business must I come up with? A business that is innovative? Must I come up with a special business? Now, the answer is no. In general, if you're going to most of the states, you are free to run and set up any forms of business, even as simple as a grocery shop, or a cafe, or taking over a franchise. Most of these businesses are acceptable. But do take notes, if you're considering Victoria states, then there are more stringent business that you could do and you can't do. Yeah, for example, at this point of time, Victoria government is focusing more on technology-based, innovative types of the business. Let's look at number 3. There is also, it comes also the residency requirements to make sure that you spend relatively, reasonable amount of times in Australia to manage the business. And do take notes that this who the principal applicant is. And the amount of 3 years is 1 year out of the 3 years. But do take notes that we also need to explain, should you spend significant amount of times away from Australia, we need to make sure that you do able to explain how do you monitor and manage the business when you're away from Australia. Okay, for example, you have regular email conversation or minutes of the meetings that shows when you're back home, you continue to supervise the business or to oversee the business. All right. Now, talking about this business you're required to run 2 years in Australia, it comes with the turnover requirements as well. The last 12 months before year of the 2 years, the business turnover should have been at least 300,000 Aussie dollar. Okay, so that is compulsory. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 are compulsory. But when we talk about item number 5 and item number 6, you may notice that there are 3 conditions here. And the requirements is for you to only achieve any of the 2. So what are these 3? Let's take a look. First, the company that you own in Australia, it should have at least 2 staff, and they must be a PR or citizen. Non-immediate family member, meaning to say you can't put your spouse in, or you can't put your children in, and consider as the staff. Of course, they can work, but the government doesn't consider them as one of the 2. All right. Now, and you're not required to employ or demonstrate the 2 staff across the 24 months, but rather the last 12 months before you convert into the PR. All right. Now, when it comes to the assets, these assets, there are 2 ways of governments looking at it. First is your total assets of 600,000 in Australia, which includes the business asset as well as your personal assets, such as your property, your cash on hand, your company's net worth of 600,000, of which another criteria is the business asset of 200,000. So if you look at the numbers, if assuming your business meet 200,000, then the personal asset should have at least 400,000. And if you meet the assets of 600,000, 200,000, then it is not necessary for you to employ 2 staff. But if you don't meet both the assets, then you need to employ 2 staff and combine with one of the assets that you fulfill. All right. So these requirements and successfully converted into the PR if you are guided properly. And what we do is after the first stage is granted, we continue to carry your hand through, make sure that you are guided properly, your accounts is being taken care properly, and being reviewed by us, for all the submissions. We carry your hand through until the PI is granted. Next, I would like to share about the investor and significant investor stream. As you can see under the business stream, there's only one option, which is the 188A business innovation. But when it comes to the investor, right, there are 2 options for you to consider. Again, it is a 2 stages visa, like 188A. 188B refer to investor, and 188C refers to significant investor. It explains from my slides here, the difference is the investment amount, 2.5 million and 5 million. And I will explain what are you allowed to invest this 2.5 million and 5 million into. And after investing over a period of 3 years and continue to hold on to your investment until you have successfully converted into the PR, then you can decide on what you want to do with your investment amount. Okay, and let me show you or explain what are the requirements on the stage 1. Now, age has always been one of the important considerations under the programs. For 188B, you are required to be below 55 years old. Again, as highlighted earlier, Western Australia or South Australia do consider age favor if you are above 55, and do consider exploring the 188B. So 188C, on the other hand, do open up to any age. And from among my clients, the elders under the 188C programs, are the clients of the age of 74 years old. So so these programs open up, to anybody, any age, without any restrictions. Point system under 188B, it does come with the point system, but 188C, doesn't need to fulfill the point system, and that is not applicable to 188C. So when we talk about the investment amount, 2.5 million, 5 million, obviously you need to demonstrate that you own that much of the asset, and that is important for immigrations to assess if you have the financial capacity to be able to invest. And when we talk about invest, when are you investing? You're not investing right from the beginning. You're investing when the visa is ready for approval. So, and based upon the current processing time, 188B does take on average about 18 months, whereas 188C could be as fast as 4 months, 3 months, 4 months. But if you need extra times to arrange your funding, that can also be arranged for you to have sufficient times to arrange your funding. Now, when we talk about this 188B, often the times the parents ask me, Desmond, can I pass the money to my children and apply, and help my kids to apply under 188B? And we have seen the needs, and the parents are trying to explore these options because, like what James had mentioned earlier, the general skill migration has been very tough, to a lot of the graduates, including those graduates that are already living in Australia. So the parents are looking at all the possible alternatives, to get the children a PR in Australia. Now, the answer to the 188B is you can't just pass the fund across over to your children and get them to apply for that visa, because the requirements for this 188B 2.5 million is it has to be self-earned, and the funds has to come from either business activity or the investment activity from the applicants themselves. Okay, we must demonstrate how the funds are coming from, but of course, under the migration policy, we are not required to match how this 2.5 million accumulated dollar to dollar, but we just have to show that, you know, the visa applicants is a business owner and for X number of years, and what are the investment activity. If they do manage a portfolio of investment, what are the investment incomes looks like over the years, and the government of Australia is going to assess whether or not it is reasonable for that persons to own that much of the funds to be able to invest into these programs. As compared to 188B, 188C, on the other hand, can be gifted the fund. So goes back to the question, we also do have parents who helps the children to get the 188C visa by giving the children, you know, the fund. Yeah. So that funds can be inheritance, can come from inheritance, and can be given to, you know, from anybody, whether their parents or, you know, their grandparents. Yeah, so that is allowable. Okay. Now, 188B do require residency of 2 years over the 5 years, whereas 188C do require 40 days, average of 40 days per year, yeah, in Australia. So again, you know, it's the amount of time spent in Australia is relatively very minimum. So, and this is the first stage. When it comes to the second stage, it's very straightforward and simple. All it does is for you to fulfill the residency, for you to hold the investment for at least 3 years, and no criminal records. That would be the basic. That would be the basic criteria, and all the criteria that it takes for you to consider or to get a PR for the investor visa. And that without running the business. If you want to, you can, but it is not a requirement for you to run the business in Australia. Okay. Now, talking about, you know, what to invest for 188B and 188C, let's have a look at this. So under the immigration terms, they name it compliant investment. But what does this compliant investment mean is really all the managed funds. Okay. So just to clarify, you're not allowed to buy a property and consider property, you know, that investment as part of your 2.5 million or 5 million. They all goes to, you know, into these 3 category of funds. The first option is mixed funds. So generally, what are those mixed funds? For example, bonds, fixed income funds, REITs, for example. So you may look at that, right? These are the conservative investment portfolio that gives you perhaps, you know, average of 4 to 6% of return per annum. Okay, and that cater for 50% of your total investment amount. The next category is share fund. So these are all the equity funds. Yeah, do take notes. You're not allowed to just go and invest directly through this Australian Stock Exchange, but you got to invest through the approved fund manager by the Australian immigrations, that they are the one that know what to be invest. And when you talk about these share funds, they generally invest into the funds or equity or share, the portfolio of the share with the company of the market cap of below 500 million Aussie dollar. So they are not a relatively small company, but you know, they are relatively a huge company. And this category of funds do on average gives an average returns about 8% that we have seen, you know, from our clients' portfolio in the past. And next, the last category is venture capital, 20%. So that explains, you know, these are the company mostly pre-IPO. So they go for the pre-IPO, those company with the huge potential, and of course, you know, it does gives a higher returns. There are mechanisms that are also the investment approach that this fund manager use to manage to reduce the risk of these venture capital funds, and to make sure that a certain stability and you know, is protected, the client's investment is being protected. So that gives you some idea on what you can invest Now, that kind of bring you through both the business and investment migration. I think one last important highlight from me is always about the health check. Clients has always asked me, by going through all these steps, process of the business investment migration, and we are going through 2 stages, both temporary residents and permanent residents. What about my health, or I do come across some medical situation after being in Australia? So the answer is, when you apply for the 188, the medical health check is being performed at the stage of 188. And should you fulfill that requirements, that medical health check is considered as deemed and is used, and the medical requirements for 888 is deemed as met as well, by virtue of you meeting the 188 health requirements. Unless during the first stage, you do have medical condition that needs to be supervised and need to be monitored, then you will have to go through some health undertaking and checks subsequently. So if you do have some medical condition, do talk to us, and we will guide you through, and we will advise you to make sure that you are all being advised correctly, so that you would know if there is any implication or not. So I think this is about what these are the information that I would like to share with everybody this morning. And I hope that you find this presentation from James and myself informative. And thank you. And over to you, please, Audrey.
Thank you, Desmond. Okay, we have James as well. Thank you, Desmond and James. Okay, so let's catch up with the Q&A session at the soonest before any other further interruptions. So I've got question pending from just now, James, which is for the GTI. So there's someone asking, does the GTI include public sector management as a sector by itself?
Not as a sector, no. So, but there are some that could be related. For example, there's an infrastructure sector, which could be related to that. It doesn't matter whether the applicant is in commercial, industry or public sector. We want to see skills and achievements that relate to one of these functional areas. So like developing infrastructure, IT projects, resources, any of these. So it doesn't exclude people in public service, but that as itself is not a sector that's in one of the priority areas.
Right. Okay. And age is not a concern, right? Because this person is also saying that they meet all requirements except that he's 70 years old.
It's not a concern, but it's something we do have to still consider as part of the criteria. So when I say it's not a concern, it doesn't rule you out. So with someone that's 70, the first thing I want to make sure is they're intending to be involved in that industry. Now, they don't have to be full-time. For example, we sometimes have people that are in a semi-retired state, but they still are involved in speaking, in maybe writing articles or publishing or doing educational teaching, in that area. So we do want to see they're still going to be involved. If they're intending to retire and not be involved at all, they won't be suitable, because remember, one of the requirements is they have got the potential to be a benefit to Australia. So we have to show that they are going to have, or they're intending to have some involvement in that industry in Australia. They're not required to as a visa condition, but we want to show that intent is there. So that would be the main consideration, that showing the government that they are intending to still be involved in that area in some active way that's going to be beneficial to Australia.
Okay, thank you, James. I hope that answers the question. And next question, Desmond, it's for you. It is about 188B. How long does someone need to hold the investment for the 188B?
So the requirements is 3 years plus the duration of the application for the PR. So once your PR is granted, then you are free and to decide and go with whatever that you wanted to do with the money.
I see. And usually how long does it take for the PR to be granted after fulfilling requirements?
So based upon the current processing times, it takes really, quite a long time. We have experienced and seen clients taking about a year and a half now to convert into the PR. And again, the investment migration is a focus. And for hopefully the government is also giving some priority to those investors who is based onshore. Right now, we have seen governments giving priority and speed up the processing time for the first stage of 188. Hopefully, in the future, the governments do speed up the processing of the 888, the second stage as well.
Thank you, Desmond. James, next question is for you. So this is pertaining to skill migration. If I begin an application via 190 or 491 today, what is the expected timeline for migration?
Right, and that depends upon lots of factors. Now, when you say begin, if you're just starting the journey, there are several steps we have to go through, and some of these are indefinite. What I mean by that is you are dependent upon clearing certain stages and waiting until you can be invited to move on further. So let me rephrase this. So the first steps are showing you're qualified. So you do what's called a skill assessment, where you get confirmation from authority in Australia that you meet the requirements for an occupation. You need to meet English requirements. We can then put you forward for consideration under the expression of interest. We can't move ahead with the visa application until you're actually invited. So that's either you've won a place through competing by points, or a state territory government has decided they want to support your application for Australia. So that's the general waiting period. So that's kind of like a waiting room where you're waiting to be able to move ahead. And that period, we don't know. It could be short, it could be long, it may not happen depending upon the circumstances. So we don't know how long that period's going to be. But if you are invited and you're then able to apply for the visa, you'll get 60 days to make your visa application. And then the processing of the visa itself does vary a little bit, and has varied obviously during the pandemic period. But we're typically expecting somewhere between 5 to 12 months as a typical kind of processing time.
Okay. While we are on that, James, there's another question about the outlook for IT skills for 190 or 491 pathways, because with few states right now accepting offshore applicants. So do you see any positive movement so far for this?
Yeah, look, I think the prospects are good generally, and IT is close to my heart. I'm ex-IBM, so IT is very close to my heart. But the problem is with IT, and the challenge, I guess, with IT rather than problem, is there's very competitive, and there's a lot of competition in this space. But there are also opportunities. So we are expecting high numbers of IT people getting through the program, but it is very competitive. And we haven't seen any significant opening yet, but it's heading in that direction. So my feeling is that probably later this year, we will see more opportunities arising. The program year for immigration commences on the 1st of July of each year. And typically we'll see revisions of opportunities under skilled migration. So the various occupations and what the needs are for those occupations for the various states and territories coming out typically around July, August, September kind of time frame. So one thing with skilled migration, I do encourage people, if you are looking at this, get in early. So even though I'm saying there may not be opportunities arising in significance until July, August, September, if you get in now, you get yourself ahead in the queue. You can get the preliminary steps done, which can take a few months, such as the skill assessment, English language test, and so on. Get all the documentation together and get yourself in the queue for consideration. Now, often with a lot of the aspects of skilled migration, being in the queue earlier gives you a priority, because priority is generally given to people that are in the queue earlier and also have higher points. Those are the two main considerations for priority in terms of getting an invitation earlier. So get in the queue earlier. Skill assessments generally are valid for 3 years. English language test results are valid for 3 years as well. It does say 2 years on the test results, but the Australian government accepts it for 3 years. So if you do this now, you get in now, you've got a 3-year window for your skill assessment, for your English language test. So you're getting yourself in early, you're putting yourself ahead of anyone else coming in later, and you're keeping your options open for the next 3 years. So that will cover developments happening later this year. So that would be my advice around this.
Sure. Thank you, James. for skill. Next question is for Desmond. So under the 188C, Desmond, are the funds brought into Australia taxable in Australia?
Well, in general, the funds that you're bringing over to Australia is not taxable. What is taxable is the returns, the incomes that you have generated from the investment. But again, there's also certain types of investment returns that is not taxable. There's only certain parts that are subjected to the tax depending on what you are investing into. Yeah. So to answer that question, in general, the funds that you're bringing across over to Australia, for the first 5 million, you're not paying a tax on that 5 million, but it's the returns out of the 5 million.
Right, great. Thank you.
Returns, yeah.
Thank you, Desmond. While you're on that, I think this is also relevant to you. Are there any special preference or exceptions given by WA for PR compared to other states? So, and what are the exceptions? Is there any other exceptions other than the age waiver? Maybe you can explain a little bit on that.
Sure. We talk about age waiver and we talk about the amount of the investment as well. The amount of investment relatively is much lower. Now, what is really unique about WA, right? It's not so much about the amount of investment, but rather the value of the asset that you hold. For example, let's say you were to invest into the business for 150,000 as an example, but over the 2 years, your business started making profits and the value of your company meets or goes up to 200,000 or go more than 200,000. And that is the asset value that the WA is asking for. Let me give you an example. For example, if you are going to Western New South Wales, the investment is 500,000. So regardless of how much the business worth, but your initial investment is 500,000. So same thing, your amount of investment to Western Australia is 400,000. That is the amount that you need to be invested into. Back to WA, regardless of what amount is, they require you to just meet a minimum of 200,000 net worth. So that net worth, for those from the accounting background, so that net worth could basically consist of, the profits that you have generated over 2 years, which make the company, become more value, in a layman's term. So that's what they are looking out for. Another aspect is, the WA government is quite flexible with the types of the business that you are setting up. And that actually gives it is one of the attractive and important aspect of the consideration. Yeah, but of course, WA remain very strong in terms of the number of the migrants. Among the migrants, WA has taken up quite a big amount of the migrants. Yeah, and mainly due to the same time zone, the shortest flight times, for example. These are all the important considerations. Yes. Thank you, Audrey.
Okay, thanks, Desmond. Next question is on study. James, this is for you. For the study option, is there a minimum years of study or preferred courses in order to get higher chances for migration, basically?
Yeah, look, and yes, there are. So first of all, there is an open work visa available after study in Australia, and that requires 2 years of study in Australia. Now, a recent change to the rules for this have allowed people to do online study from overseas that can be considered towards that 2 years. So that's an interesting development as a result of the pandemic. So 2 years of study is the general requirement to have that open work visa available after the course has been completed. The 2 years can also be made up of multiple courses that add up to 2 years. In terms of the options and requirements, where you study in Australia has a big difference. For example, I get people that come to me too late and get advice from me too late. So they might go and do a Bachelor of Marketing in Melbourne, So if you were to go into a Bachelor of Marketing or Bachelor of Economics in Melbourne, and Melbourne's a very popular destination in Australia, if we use marketing as an example, if you're in a marketing role in Melbourne, you cannot be sponsored for permanent residency as a marketing specialist. It's a dead end, regardless of whether you study or not. It's a dead end for employer-sponsored pathways for marketing specialists in Melbourne. It's one of those limitations in Australia. And Victorian government doesn't sponsor marketing people for general skilled migration to also get permanent residency. So if you study marketing in Melbourne, even if you went to a prestigious university there, that's a dead end for you as far as general skilled migration goes or employer-sponsored migration. But if you did the same study in, let's say, South Australia, in Adelaide, you get additional points for the fact that you've studied in a regional area, lower population area. Your study costs or your living costs are going to be lower during a study period because it's a lower living cost city. And the South Australian government has pathways for most occupations, including marketing, for people that have studied there to actually get their residency. So there's a huge difference in where and how you study and what you study that need to be considered for this. But you could study, for example, if you're studying IT in Melbourne, then there may well be pathways that go through. So it does depend upon a lot of factors, what sort of course, where they're studying, age would be a consideration as well. So there are a lot of important factors to be considered there.
Thank you, James.
Sorry, Audrey, just to add on to what James has said about the study, right? I just wanted to add on and remind everyone, James does also hold the education license. So our team can also assist you if you're looking for the right advice on the study, even the enrollment. We do have this support to help you out. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I'm Australian as well, so I did my own study in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Next question is actually on medicals. James, perhaps I'll pose this to you. Does existing medical conditions like diabetes, hypertension, and heart conditions exclude an applicant under 188?
Yeah. So first of all, there's no conditions that automatically exclude someone. What the government does, they consider different factors and what the costs are going to be to the government. Because remember, in Australia, when you get your permanent residence, you get free public health care. So the government needs to weigh up, and essentially they're weighing up, do we think the economic benefits of having you in Australia outweigh the expected medical costs? Now, everyone's going to have some medical costs in Australia. The government realizes that. When we're all human, we all get sick at some stage, so everyone will have medical costs. But what they're concerned with, are those medical costs going to be substantial? And we have various benchmarks for this. We are talking very large amounts, and we are talking about costs estimated over a long period, which can be 10 years or could be lifelong, depending upon the type of condition. So really, to summarize this, if it's a medical condition that's not likely to have excessively high medical costs, then it's not likely to be an issue. And this is something we can understand when we talk to you. We'll ask you about questions about the history of the medical condition, what medication do you take? And we do have clients to get through this that do have diabetes. We have clients that have hypertension. Look, I myself, I got hypertension after I left Australia and moved to Asia. It gave me hypertension. And I think that's also reflective of the work-life balance situation we have in Asia versus Australia. It's one of the factors there that you do have lower blood pressure when you move to Australia, and reverse, I think, when you come to Asia. So, we look in terms of these, and we have clients to get through successfully where they have these conditions. Typically, we're going to be concerned with things like HIV because the medication costs are very, very high. And we're looking at, $12,000, $15,000 a year worth of medication. But if you're on hypertension, even if you're taking medication, if you're diabetic, and even if you're taking medication, as long as the costs are not excessively high, it's generally not going to be an issue. But that's something we'll determine and advise you on a case-by-case basis. We have a lot of experience in this area, and we can give you a very accurate estimate of whether or not it's likely to be an issue.
Sure. Thank you, James. Desmond, next question will be for you. Besides GTI or investment migration, are there any other options at all? Example, funds parked in government bonds.
Sure. Now, the government bond is no longer an option after the 1st of July last year, which used to be a very popular and commonly known options under 188B. But in my opinion, the movement by removing the government bond is the right and the best decision ever that I have seen done by the governments. From my clients' perspective, they love all this compliant investment and the funds much more better than Australian government bond, which used to give 0.1% of returns, almost zero. And now, from the investment they gained, they get relatively a good returns. Yeah, and in the past, they even though they would if they were to choose to invest into the funds under 1AB, but it was not an option. Everybody kind of get forced to invest into the government bond. And I just want to take this opportunity to educate, to challenge you to think differently. And a lot of people think that the government bond is much better, but think about it, 0.1%. And if you look at all other compliant investment, that gives you historical performance and all the statistics. And for example, I mean, I can just share with you out loud, my investment into this compliant investment, of course, it's not 5 million, but partially, on a small amount, last year was a fantastic return of about 20%. It was an opportunity for a lot of people. I've seen clients add on more investment into that amount, but my experience last year was 20%. And I was so happy about that. Yeah.
Great, Desmond. We need to learn from you. So while I have you, Desmond, perhaps you can answer this question. This is actually on spouse visa category. So does the spouse category involve legally married only, or also can be partners who wish to marry in future in Australia? Can this also be considered as a spouse category?
Sure. So under this spouse category, the immigration do take into consideration married and de facto. So if you both are living together as a husband and wife, but of course there are certain criteria for us to determine whether or not you fulfill the de facto criteria, such as financial aspect. You have to take into consideration whether or not you both share assets or living expenses together. Their commitment aspect, whether or not you both nominating each other in your will or as a beneficiary, as an example, right? There's also social aspect. There are also, a few other aspects that you must demonstrate. So ultimately what the governments would like to look at, from this partnership or this relationship is it is being genuine, and it is genuine and ongoing, right? And you're not living there as a boyfriend and a girlfriend. But again, back to this question, it is not a requirement for you both to be legally married. Thank you.
Thank you, Desmond. Next question, James, is on skill migration again. I think this is an important question. Basically, our experience on skill migrations for individuals under legal field.
Okay. Yeah. Legal field is quite onerous to go through. So anyone who wants to migrate under general skilled migration as a legal professional, and the main occupations we have here are solicitor and barrister. Of course, terminology varies between country, but basically they have to be admitted first in Australia as a legal professional. So they have to be admitted to one of the state legislative authorities before they can start the immigration process. And that may typically involve some study. You may need to study the Australian Constitution. You may need to pass an exam, depending upon your background and what study you've got, but that needs to be done first. Of course, talk to us first to understand about the pathway, but before we can actually get to a visa stage, you will need to get admitted. Even if you don't need a practicing certificate, you still need to get admitted to one of the authorities in Australia as a legal professional. So there are opportunities, and in fact, legal professionals were moved to the higher priority list a few years ago. They were on the lower priority list prior to that, but you will need to go through that process. So if you are looking at this, talk to us, but also in parallel, start looking at the admission requirements for one of the state or territory authorities in Australia. If you don't have that information, reach out to us and we can pass those details to you.
Thank you, James. Desmond, next question is for you. Can the conditions for investment and skill migration be considered for a person who is 45 this year, but holds a master's from an Australian university?
So can you repeat the question? You're asking whether or not that investment can be considered as
Investment,
for those, for benefiting those who is applying under the general skill migration?
Yeah, it's basically, can the conditions for investment and skill migration be considered for someone who's 45 this year? So I guess if someone is 45 this year, skill migration is out.
Yes.
Investment, right? So, and this is for someone who holds a master's from Australian university.
Right. Yeah. So the answer is no, not for skill migration. If you are above 45 or you have already hit 45 and general skill migration is out, so you need to then consider, other alternative programs, for example, GDI, without the age. It's very difficult to give some reference or some directions to these people, but it's best to talk to us about your backgrounds. What have you been doing, your qualification? Let us look into that and advise you on what could be a more appropriate pathway for you.
I can just add something there. Although general skilled migration has an age cut of 45, there is a very narrow pathway. If you've got a job offer in Australia, you've got a high salary offer in Australia, you've got an employer in Australia that's willing to support you, there is a very special pathway and strategy we have. It is complex, but we can get an age waiver for the 45, not for general skilled migration, but for the skilled employer sponsored. But very narrow. You need a very supportive employer in Australia. You need a high salary in Australia. Certain skill sets it's restricted to. But if you're in that unique situation, talk to us, because there is a strategy we have that can get an age waiver.
Okay, sure. Okay, I think we're running out of time for today already. Last question. I think we'll end the question with a bit of New Zealand. What are the latest requirements for migration to New Zealand, so that everyone knows?
Me, Desmond?
Yes, James. Oh, yes, sorry.
Sure. Okay, yep. Both Desmond and I are both licensed advisors from New Zealand. So New Zealand, a bit different to Australia. New Zealand actually put most of their visas on hold. So you couldn't apply for visas during the pandemic period. A lot of the programs are still on hold. So skilled migration for New Zealand is completely on hold at the moment. Hopefully, I'm hoping that will open mid to late this year. But investment migration has continued throughout the pandemic period. Processing has slowed down significantly, but the program has still been continuing. So, and it's still open and still continues to be open. So that's investment-based migration. Investment migration for New Zealand starts at 3 million New Zealand dollars, although in practice, we can get that reduced down to 2.5 million. There is no business owner visa for New Zealand, but there is an entrepreneur pathway, relatively low cost, but you must have an innovative or exporting or high growth business idea to carry out New Zealand. Education's on hold for New Zealand, overseas education. So at the moment, New Zealand is basically an option for investment migration, although processing will be quite long. Skilled is on hold, education's effectively on hold. Employer sponsored can still be done for certain critical skills, but the rest is on hold. So we'll have to wait probably till later this year for general skilled migration to open up for New Zealand, for general employer sponsored to open up, and for education to open up.
Okay, thank you. Okay, apologies that is all the questions that we can take for today. For all the pending questions, we will come back to you. And alternatively, also, please get in touch with us. The email is on the screen. Especially for general skill migration questions, please email us your details together with your CV so that we can actually do a faster turnaround time in coming back to you on your eligibility.
And CV for your spouse. If you have a spouse, CV for your spouse. Very important.
Exactly. All right. So just before we conclude the session, I would just like any words of advice from Desmond and James. Desmond, you first.
Sure. Yeah, if any one of you out there looking at, the right and what is the suitable pathway for you, do talk to us. We are ready to guide you properly. And yeah, we are there, hoping that we are part of the, the team, in terms of guiding you through your migration plan. Yeah, that's my words.
Thank you, Desmond. James?
Yeah, look, my advice has always been the same over the years, which is always start early, get the advice early, because migration gets harder, it's more competitive over time, requirements increase, so it does get more competitive over time. But even more so right now, a lot of people are rethinking, as Audrey mentioned, they're rethinking their life goals, their objectives, not just because it's a new year, but they've had a reset, a massive reset like we've never had before about what they want out of life. And things like the work-life balance, the opportunities for the children, the open space, having a large landed house, cheap cars, a range of fresh food available. These things, I think, are going to be massive attractors to people that maybe were ambivalent and not so sure about migration, but they have reset their values and their needs and realized that life's short and they need to take active steps. So I think we're going to see huge numbers, huge increases of people wanting to migrate. So even more so than before, I think it's very important to start early. Even if you're not definite about wanting to migrate, find out your options now to know whether or not it's something you need to start earlier and what the situation is like. So that's important to understand and then make your decisions. But I think it's going to get very, very competitive. And I think there'll be a lot of demand. There'll be a lot of opportunities, but at the same time, I think we're going to see record numbers of people applying compared to before, because I can understand why people will start making these decisions that they might have put off before, but really see that need now and reevaluating what they want from life.
All right. Thank you, James. I guess we can conclude now. It's 12 o'clock. And once again, thanks for everyone. I think practically everyone stayed through the entire 1.5 hours. That's really good to know. Once again, apologies for the technical and non-technical hiccups that took place. Okay, we look forward to hear from you. Please stay in touch and have a good weekend, everyone, and stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.